Let me spread manure on it for one more year. And if it doesn't bear fruit, cut it down. Thanks be to God. Every time I read this passage, I chuckle because I've been told by several people that that's the job of the pastor. I don't know if it means saving people or spreading manure. But it is what it is. But there's a serious side of this reading, this parable. As one of the readings the church used during the Inquisition, this was one of them that gave them the right to destroy the Jews who would not convert to Christianity. It was the cornerstone of their attack. We're giving them time. We're digging the ground up. We're teaching them about Jesus. And if they don't convert, if they don't recant their Judaism, then we can take an axe to them, just as this parable says. We hear Paul talk about those who got God cut off when they wouldn't listen. And I don't know about you, but it kind of leaves me in a judgmental mood. Smite them, Lord, for they don't want to heed your Son. But in totally truthfulness, I think Jesus is telling us completely the opposite. This is not a parable. This is not a time of teaching that's about judgment whatsoever. In fact, it's about the opposite. Jesus leads to this parable with two questions after he hears what Pilate did with the Galileans' blood. In other words, he killed them and he left them in their sacrificial places. You see, Pilate hated religion. He hated rituals. He was a government official. That was it. Yes, religion was tied into the Roman government, but actually Pilate wasn't crazy about that as well. It caused people to do crazy things, unpredictable things. He wanted legislation that people followed the rules. I guess today we would call him an atheist. But he didn't like religion, and he certainly didn't like this Jewish religion, which caused these people to become stiff-necked, stand up against them, even at the chance of dying. And so he accommodated them, these Galileans. But you know how rumor swirls. You know how people look on things like that, especially if you're coming from a religious mode. Well, if that happened, God must have had a reason to let that happen. Especially the later one that Jesus brings up about the tower falling in, collapsing on people. We don't know if it was during a siege, a battle, or what. We just know that Jesus brings this up. There was a time, I don't know if it was recent or long past, where there was a tower that fell on these individuals in Jerusalem. But Jesus turns and he addresses the rumors that swirl. Well, if they were there and those towers fell, there must be a reason. Or, at the very least, ask the question, where's God when this happens? Either way, you're passing judgment, either on the individual or on God himself. And this is what Jesus is addressing. That living under the law, that living under religiosity in such a way that we feel we have to pass judgment on all things. There has to be a reason. And the bottom line is either God is absent or God is pushing the smite button. And so Jesus starts to unpack this parable. It's a parable about a master, a landowner who has a fig tree. He's been going to that fig tree for 3 years. It hasn't produced any fruit. And so, as far as he's concerned, let's cut it out of the ground. Let's not let it waste any more soil, any more nutrients. Let's get rid of it. We think that's just a judgment from the hip. We think it's an angry landowner. We We don't understand the laws that undergird what he's saying. What he's saying is, according to the harvest law, I'm allowed to give this fig tree 3 years of nurture before it produces its first fruit. And when it does produce that first fruit, I'm supposed to take that as a praise fruit, as a first fruit offering to the temple. It hasn't happened. And so according to the law, I cut it down. Then we have this gardener that intervenes. The gardener invites the landowner to think outside the law. The gardener invites the landowner to turpentine his imagination, to loosen it up a little bit. What's it going to hurt if I break up the ground, put a little bit manure on it, a little bit more manure on it, and see if it'll produce fruit the next year? See, we get tied up in numbers. 3 years, 1 year, 4 years, add them all up. We figure out formulas and ways of converting people. And that's not what this is about. This is Jesus laying down what the law will do for us, to us, if we let it. It's the same law that forces us, the religious laws, that forces us to look at catastrophic things that happen and figure out how God is judging or how God is absent in a situation. Either one is dangerous in our relationship with God and with each other. That's what Jesus is laying out for his disciples. They're good Hebrews. He knows what's rolling around in their minds. It's one or the other, and either one is dangerous. And so Jesus lays down before them the difference between law and grace. Yes, the one who owned the fig tree, he had every right according to the law to ask for it to be cut down. There is no argument. But Jesus throws the little curveball and says, what happens if we let grace interject into this? What happens with that relationship between the gardener and the master? What happens in that relationship between the gardener and the fig tree? What happens in that relationship with the fig tree and everyone else when it starts to bear fruit? What happens when we stop judging and we start smearing grace around? Jesus will reveal later on in Luke that good things happen. You see, what we forget is that Jesus got hung on a cross because he was a lawbreaker. Because he took the law, showed it into the Pharisees' face, and then did just the opposite. Luke will tell us later in Luke 13 that Jesus will be in the synagogue. He will be preaching, and a woman who is hunched over, who is under the weight of some kind of disease, some illness, appears in the back of the synagogue, probably looking through the lattice work because she's separated because of her illness and she's a woman. Jesus does the unthinkable. He invites that woman into the center of worship and he heals her. Let's go over the laws that he broke. First, he invited a woman into the synagogue, the center of the synagogue, where the scriptures are read. That's one. Second, he invited someone who was ill into the synagogue, who has a demon of some sort, because God would not let this person be crippled over if God didn't intend it to happen. That's two. And then third, he laid his hands on someone who was ill and in turn made himself impure as he stood in the middle of the synagogue. That's 3 and that's 4. But out of that, Jesus takes and he heals this woman. He restores her to community. He makes community whole. So by stepping outside the law, by using a divine imagination, by turpentine his imagination and letting it form instead of inside the law, inside the boundaries of grace, he creates wholeness in a community. That's what this parable is about. It's about giving life instead of the law, casting a death shadow over everything. It's about learning how to live inside of grace and outside of the law in such a way that you're more concerned about others than you are yourself. It's about freeing people so that when they see what Pilate did to the Galileans, when they saw the devastation of the tower falling, instead of standing and trying to figure out where God was judging or whether God was absent in their lives, we become the gardener and we start to remove the rubble to see if there's someone to help. We start to seek out the families that are left behind over the devastation of those who were lost by the falling of the tower. We start to go and see if there's a way that we can restore community, whether it's cleaning the temple or cleaning the synagogue that is made impure because of the blood, or whether it's seeking out the families of those who just lost their lives to Pilate. You see, that's what grace does. Grace steps outside the law and seeks how it can make community whole. Finds a way that it can give life where death seems to prevail. Grace enables us to see God in the brokenness that's around us. Whether it's a tower falling, whether it's someone losing their life by some heinous act, whether it's someone who is hunched over and who is struggling under an illness. Instead of sitting back and judging through the law, instead of trying to figure out where God is causing this punishment to happen, or why God's causing this punishment to happen, or why God is absent in their lives, we see God and we seek to inject grace into those situations. That's what Jesus is talking about in this parable. He's not challenging his disciples, his Hebrew disciples, to cast judgment upon their Hebrew brothers once the church starts taking form. He's not asking them to take and cast judgment on anyone who's suffering, but instead he's challenging them to be willing to get their hands dirty, and when they see brokenness in the community, to roll up one sleeve and dig in and seeing how we can help, even if it means we are going to be elbow deep in manure. That's what Jesus is saying through this parable. It's a parable of wholeness. It's a parable that gives us the okay to step outside the law if it's going to benefit the community and give life and breath. It's a parable that identifies who we are as the church as we move through our lives, which in so many times and in so many ways is filled with brokenness. But with God with us, wholeness can be found through His grace in His Son named Jesus Christ. Amen.